Greetings and welcome. Today we're continuing our discussion of the situation of government regulation of dangerous enterprises. So let's just kind of remind ourselves of what some of the sources of technology harm, technology disaster are. We can think of businesses, for example, which involve toxic and dangerous chemicals, so chemical plants, factories which make use of toxic or dangerous chemicals. We can think also of enterprises which involve the risk of large fires or explosions. Lots of examples that are possible there. But we can also think of publicly owned activities like dams, tunnels, transportation infrastructure, which are often owned and controlled by government entities, but which are also capable of giving rise to catastrophic failures and large-scale public harm. Thinking of additional enterprises and undertakings which have the capacity for creating large harm, we can think of mining, we can think of airline companies, aviation disasters, but also aviation manufacturers. No one wants to fly in an airplane which is made by a manufacturer which has a very bad safety culture or safety record. Pharmaceutical manufacturers, another industry where serious harm can be done through breakdowns in safety culture. But we can also ask whether the service industry is capable of creating large disasters. Can the financial industry create large disasters? And I think we've got enough examples in the course already to answer this question positively. The kinds of disasters which can be created by the banking system don't create explosions and fires, but they do create massive harm to lots and lots of people, sometimes all over the globe. So where do the harms occur, which we need to be concerned about in private enterprise, private undertakings, as well as publicly owned activities? Well, first of all, we have to be worried about worker health and safety. When workers go to work for a firm or an enterprise or an undertaking, they are generally not in a position to ensure their own health and safety, and their employer doesn't have a direct economic interest in making sure that their health and safety is protected. So it remains for a regulatory agency to monitor and set standards for health and safety for workers. But a second area of harm, which is connected to dangerous activities, is the harm which can occur to people who live and work nearby the activity. So people who live near the Bhopal chemical plant in India, people who live nearby a rail yard where chlorine gas might be emitted because of a derailment of a rail car. So in other words, neighbors, the health and safety of neighbors who are adjacent to dangerous activities. In our brief study of the Texas City factory explosion or plant explosion early in the semester is a good example where thousands of people needed to be evacuated as a result of the explosion and fire at the Texas City plant. But we also have to be concerned about a broader kind of harm, environmental degradation and toxic releases of chemicals and other substances into air, water, and soil. And finally, we have to think about both short-term harms and long-term harms. The immediate risk of illness and injury, which may come about because of activities which are produced by a given kind of production process or manufacturing process. But also we have to be concerned about the long-term effects on soil, air, water, degradation, and the consequent health harms, but also other kinds of harms which are not directly harmful to health, but may be harmful to the possibility of future agricultural use of land. So there is a range of harms, from the immediate harm to the factory worker who may be hurt by a machine, to the long-term harm which a population may suffer because its grain-producing capacity is reduced because of soil damage. So what are some behavioral reasons to expect unsafe operations by independent business enterprises, corporate enterprises, and sometimes government enterprises. Well, the most basic point is that safety requires expenditure. It requires investment. In order to maintain a safe production process, it's necessary to invest in engineering and design, maintenance, oversight, training, lots of kinds of activity which are both costly and are often regarded as not being directly related to the primary business purposes of the company, may not be thought to be related to productivity and profitability. Furthermore, there is the problem which I'm sure, studied in microeconomics, but it's the problem of externalities. When a private activity creates harms which it is able to offload to the public, that's what economists refer to as an externality. And the obvious examples are the dumping of toxic byproducts, whether it's in gases which are escaping from a smokestack, or wastewater which is being dumped into the public waterways. Something I've observed in Utah, uranium tailings, which are left out in the foothills of the mountains in Utah after uranium mining was completed there in the 1940s and 50s. Smokestack emissions, which lead to acid rain, the venting of hot water into estuaries from power plants. In all of these cases, these are instances where it would be possible for the business to internalize the cost of neutralizing these harms. But if it is possible to dump the harm into a public place rather than having to privately deal with the cost of removal or storage or filtering or cleaning up or whatever, there is a business incentive to avoid those costs and to pollute the public or impose the harm on the public rather than internalizing the cost of remediation. So what about private firms? What are the motivations which private firms have? And this is not exactly rocket science. Corporations, private firms, businesses are primarily in the business of making profits. If they are publicly traded, they are also in the business of making sure that stock prices, or at least the executives and the boards, are concerned about the stock price of the business. And so financial performance, business performance, sales, profitability, controlling costs, these are the concerns which are the primary business motivations, business priorities of a privately owned activity. And one can't really argue that these priorities should not be present. Of course, a private business is looking to generate profits for its stockholders, its stakeholders. It is looking to make products in an efficient and profitable way. Furthermore, the individuals of a company, especially decision makers, their executive compensation is generally tied to the financial performance of the company. So not only do companies have the priority of profitability, but also the executives who run companies also have that priority in terms of their personal decision making. But these market imperatives make it likely that slack safety management will occur within firms, that there will be low concern, or at least worrisomely unfocused concern on worker, neighborhood, and environmental safety in the operations and production processes of privately run companies, if they were in a completely unregulated environment. Now, before we get to regulation, let's talk about government. Does government do a better job? And I think the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. But governments which run production activities like bridges or dams, government entities are vulnerable to a different set of pressures, to political pressures. There are bureaucratic incentives which decision makers within government agencies have, which have to do with the hierarchy within the government agency. There is a bureaucratic tendency to prioritize the kind of time urgent matters, but then to let long-term potential problems slide. And here in Michigan, we saw the problem of the dams, which burst in the central part of the state 4 or 5 months ago. This seems to be a great example of public-private partnership in creating a terrible disaster. The dams were privately owned, the inspection schedule from the state of Michigan seems to be flawed, and the federal inspection schedule also seems to be at risk or at fault. But there is also a perennial likelihood, and I think we do see it in the state of Michigan, we see it at the federal level as well, of agency sensitivity about harming business interests in the scope of its actions. Business has been very effective in conveying the idea that government should not get in the way, and this message is underlined by legislators, by public executives, governors, presidents, and so forth. And finally, within government, we have to take into account the fact that career considerations for executives, for directors, for decision makers within government, career considerations are not always aligned with the public good. And these career considerations may have greater salience for the actors than simply timely, effective performance in risky situations has. So it seems to me perfectly clear that the activities of a complex, technologically intensive economy and society, that there is a powerful need, an urgent need, an irreplaceable need for strong regulation, government regulation with extensive independence of regulatory authorities. That's a statement that I'm making here, and then we can evaluate it as we discuss. But if regulation of dangerous industries is to be effective, it needs to have some specific technical characteristics. First of all, the regulatory agency needs to have adequate scientific, technical, and policy expertise internally to assess complex industrial risks. It is not a winning strategy to create a very lightly staffed agency and then say, okay, you're responsible for railroad safety, even though you know nothing about railroads, you know nothing about the technology or the management systems which are in place here. So adequate scientific, technical, and policy expertise is a requirement. Secondly, there needs to be, and this is probably should be listed as the first bullet, but there needs to be a high level of independence from political pressure and business capture. These are precisely the distortions that we've seen repeatedly throughout the course, where regulatory agencies fall short in their ability to regulate, supervise, inspect the industries for which they are responsible. And that is when the agency lacks independence or lacks sufficient independence from both its political masters in legislature, in the Congress, and in the executive branch, and it is subject to pressure from the industry which it is regulating, whether it's aviation or nuclear power or whatever. But there's also the possibility of distortion of regulatory intent if a regulatory agency is intertwined with other government agencies which have a different agenda. And so if there's a mixing of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's agenda of ensuring nuclear safety with another agency which is, has the primary goal of enhancing and spreading nuclear power, well, if the two agencies, the two government offices are closely connected, the promotional agency may well have the ability to influence the regulatory process. But in order to have a regulatory system which actually fulfills its function of providing an ongoing, safe design, implementation, management, oversight, supervision of complex industrial and technological processes, if that's what we want to see, then we need to have regulatory institutions within government, both federal government, state government, maybe local government, in which there is an internal culture, an internal commitment of fair, rigorous regulation in service of the highest possible achievement of safety and culture. In other words, we need to have ethical managers and directors and inspectors and regulators who take their responsibility within the agency seriously and are empowered internally, kind of morally empowered, to resist pressure coming from other powerful political actors and private actors. We've seen a number of obstacles to traditional regulatory practices. First of all, since 1980, since Ronald Reagan's war on the Air Traffic Controllers Union, we've seen a very powerful neoliberal push towards privatization, towards the idea that we should let the private sector handle basically all social problems, let the private companies handle safety. They have an economic interest in being safe. That claim is made. It's not a very believable claim, but the claim is made. And there is the idea that government regulation interferes with profitable business practice. Well, I've already indicated that in one sense that's true, that government regulation imposes additional costs because safety requires cost, and the business enterprise by itself would not undertake those costs. So these are net new costs, but that's what safety for the public requires. Another important obstacle that we've seen is political pressure on regulatory agencies coming from the executive branch, the legislative branch. That's one reason why I mentioned professional ethics and the internalized ethic which leaders and scientists and policymakers in the EPA and the FDA and the Centers for Disease Control and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that those regulators, those custodians of the public health and safety, have a moral obligation, a moral duty to act independently and not to yield to pressure either from other government sources or from the private sector. And then another obstacle is limits on enforcement and compliance powers. And I don't mean anything very esoteric about this, but simply the fact that there is a limit to how effectively it's possible to implement regulations with compliance sanctions, compliance penalties, compliance incentives, which are sufficient to bring about compliance. And we'll talk about compliance a little more fully in a couple of minutes. Quoting from the text you read from my book, it is clear then that regulatory systems face substantial obstacles in their mission to ensure the safety of complex, expensive technologies. A critical challenge for regulatory agencies is the role that economic and political power plays in deforming the operations of governmental agencies to serve the interests of the powerful. Regulatory agencies are captured by the powerful industries they are supposed to oversee, whether through influence on the executive branch or through incessant and effective lobbying of the legislative branch. That statement is put rather bluntly, and it's language which is, I think, pretty familiar to you also from Charles Perrow. And for the purpose of our course, I want to put it that the problem of creating regulation is one that must be solved, but it is not insolvable. It is possible through public policy design, it is possible to design regulatory systems which are reasonably effective. That's the claim I would like to put, but it is a real puzzle. It's a Rubik's Cube puzzle for public policy experts, for you as budding public policy experts, for legislators, and for designers of governmental institutions to design regulatory systems which actually work. The compliance question is really crucial. And why is it crucial? Well, it's crucial because in one way, it's the problem of a tiny policeman trying to subdue a very large crowd. There's an imbalance of power between the regulatory agency and the business. Businesses are powerful. They are complex, powerful actors within their space of activity. And I put this in terms of business, but the University of Michigan is a $3 to $5 billion enterprise. It has plenty of resources to hire the best lawyers, the best accountants, the best engineering expertise, and this is true of a university and it's true of a large corporation. They have the expertise they need across the board to make the decisions which are in their interest and then to defend those decisions against all comers, the public interest lobbying, regulatory agencies, and legislative agencies. Big business and big enterprises like universities are well prepared to defend their actions, strategies, and management against legal action, against public criticism, and against government intervention. They also have a sense of confidence that if they're found to be in the wrong, the punishment which they receive will not be ruinous. So let's turn now to the question of the organization itself. Let's focus on private enterprise, though I think you can say rather similar things about government organizations. But let's take the ideal case. What would be an ideal safety organization? Let's say a medium-sized energy company which owns 3 nuclear power plants. What would be involved in having an ideal safety organization? And I would like to say it's a couple of points, and they're all kind of simple. First of all, it is a business organization whose directors, the board of directors, and executives sincerely endorse the idea that public health and safety are the highest and first priority of the business. They believe also that doing good business means being profitable within a safe environment. So they regard the health and safety requirements on the business as being part of doing good business, and they look at it as being completely compatible with being a profitable business. Secondly, an ideal safety organization is one where the leaders, supervisors, and workers share a good and informed understanding of the priorities of health and safety. And they have created an open and learning organization where individuals are encouraged to speak up about ways of increasing safety, and also observations from the plant floor to the inspectors of containment facilities in a nuclear plant to engineers who are concerned about cost cutting, that all of these inside experts are encouraged to speak up about concerns they have about current safety practices and observations they have about improving safety practices. This would also be an important element of the ideal safety organization. And in short, the ideal safety organization is a learning organization that carefully monitors its performance with regard to system safety. And remember the mistake which executives, CEOs sometimes make. We care about safety. We don't want anybody slipping on a puddle in the factory and breaking something, losing a day's work. That's an important goal, but it is not the most important goal. It is system safety. It is the organization of the factory or the nuclear plant or the airline, the organization of its practices so that large-scale accidents are minimized. The likelihood of large-scale accidents is minimized. So how is it possible to cultivate safety culture? And here I'm still on the easy case, where the board of directors and chief executives are in agreement already that safety and health come first. And then the question is how to translate this business priority into operational plans and budget allocations, and to then have a plant design and an operating plan and a strategic plan which continually enhances safety of the operation. And once we formulated that problem, it's kind of easy to say what's involved. Good design is involved. Training and education for actors at all levels is helpful. And I myself think that if executives, accountants and CEOs and financial officers and HR directors and people at lots of levels within an organization were to take a case-based course like this one on the causes of accidents and the organizational causes of accidents, safety culture would be enhanced. But here's the not so good case, the case where the board of directors and the chief executive give lip service to safety, but through their actions they show that profitability, cost cutting, and stock price performance are the real guiding priorities which lead investment decisions and management effort. Is it possible to have a safety culture in this environment? And here the problem is much harder for the outside safety consultant, let's say. Here, the safety consultant would have to make a convincing case, which I think actually can be made, but he or she would have to make a convincing case that regular investment in safety culture and in safe operations, that this regular investment does add costs on an annual basis, but it enhances productivity throughout the cycle. That's claim number one. And claim number two, it avoids catastrophic losses occasionally. I believe that both of those claims, each of those claims is true, though it takes some argument to demonstrate that they're true. The catastrophic loss one is actually easier to demonstrate. The Gulf disaster, the blowout in the Gulf, Deepwater Horizon disaster was a disaster waiting to happen, and it cost BP a vast amount of money, much greater than what would have been involved in avoiding the accident in the first place. So our safety consultant, who's consulting with the board of directors and the CEO, needs to be able to show there's an alignment between safety culture and long-term business success. And as I say, I think that argument can be made, but it's even better if the board of directors and the chief executives have come to that conclusion all by themselves. Implementation is enhanced when there is an effective regulatory regime in place. This is actually, it's an observation about good behavior in smaller social spaces as well. When there is even a small amount of likelihood that rude behavior or rule-breaking behavior will be detected and will be punished, even in minor ways, that reinforces people's good manners, people's good behavior. And I'm putting it to you that a relatively effective regulatory regime has a very positive effect on the safety behaviors of organizations. So implementation of safety behaviors and cultures is enhanced. Implementation of these behaviors and culture will be enhanced if there is an effective regulatory regime in place where it is understood that there are penalties for unsafe behavior, that unsafe behavior will be detected and penalized, or at least with a certain probability. It's also enhanced if the penalties will accrue to individuals who are responsible for safety deviations, as well as the company's deep pockets. An effective system of regulation can serve to stabilize and enhance business commitment to safety culture. It's kind of an assurance game. We're the directors of a big energy company, let's say. We're kind of weakly committed to safety, but we also know that there is a real risk that if we are not compliant with safety regulations in a good faith way, that there will be penalties, economic penalties, which accrue. Then that kind of strengthens our resolve to be committed to a safe operation. And if we then come to believe that a safe operation is good for business and that safe operations require consistent management, investment, and participation, if we come to believe those things and we believe that the regulatory system is also out there with the possibility of imposing sanctions and penalties, then it's a kind of a virtuous circle of self-interest, intentions on the part of the company, and its compliance with a regulatory regime. But of course, we know in private life, but we also know in economic life, there are sometimes bad actors. And in almost any sector you think of, there are businesses you can probably recall from news items which have cut corners, which have disregarded the regulations and the safety requirements of their industry. And what is needed in order to remove those bad actors? Well, first of all, financially meaningful fines for violations. It is simply laughable that the meatpacking industry was found responsible for violations of health management issues during the COVID only 2-3 months ago by OSHA, and that workers in several plants had gotten sick and had died, and that the fines were $15,000 for each plant. So that was a total of $30,000 in fines. Ridiculous. So if the fines enforcement mechanism is not meaningful, then it's not going to influence behavior. Loss of license is a much more meaningful possibility, and in some fields, including, I believe, the pharmaceutical field, if the company is faced with the possibility of losing its license, it pays a lot more attention to its compliance with regulations in the industry. If there is the possibility of criminal and civil charges against executives who knowingly carry out practices that violate existing safety regulations, that's also a very powerful disincentive to be a bad actor. And in mining, of course, there's the case 4 or 5 years ago of disaster that killed a significant number of miners, and the CEO of the mining company was held criminally responsible. There is the intriguing possibility that international institutions might be helpful. And often I think we're skeptical that international institutions could influence US company behavior or even government behavior. But one possibility is in the area of nuclear energy. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, conducts reviews of safety agencies internationally. And if we are interested in kind of coming to an independent assessment of how good the safety regulatory systems are for nuclear energy in multiple countries, the IAEA assessments are a very good place to start. I read several of them in preparation for today's discussion, and I'm forced to ask a couple of questions. First of all, are these assessments fact-based and rigorous? And the answer there seems to be true. Yes, that they are. Are they too friendly to the host government? There's a disturbingly fawning tone to many of these reports. Reports to the government of Japan, China, and the United States, for example. In each case, the report gives an impression of being written by diplomats who are very concerned not to offend the host country and to make observations and recommendations in the gentlest possible way. I have to assume that there is a bureaucratic reason for this, and it may be that the only way that IAEA has any leverage at all over country behavior is through persuasion, and their executives believe that offending the host country does not lead to changed behavior. It's not clear to me that the assessment that was given for the American Nuclear Regulatory Commission or for the Chinese Nuclear Governance Agency was helpful. It was helpful in the sense of being critical enough to stimulate change. The follow-up visit, which happened to NRC at the invitation, and these reports always begin, we did this report at the invitation of the host government. At the invitation of NRC and the US government, IAEA did a follow-up visit to evaluate the NRC's response to the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. And it notes in the report the progress which NRC has made in implementing the recommendations. It is a very mild report, but I would like for you to remember the blistering critique that was offered of NRC's response to its own task force by David Lochbaum, the expert nuclear scientist from the Union of Concerned Scientists, to the Congressional Committee. You viewed the video 2-3 weeks ago. And if you contrast the tone of the IAEA reports with the GAO report that we read about NRC's performance with regard to the Davis-Bessie incident, there's just a striking contrast of tones. It poses for us the question, what mechanisms exist to improve the oversight capability of the federal regulatory commissions, regulatory agencies for various dangerous industries around the world? And I guess I'm no longer thinking that IAEA is a very powerful lever for improving performance. What about international comparisons? Here I have a little bit more confidence that public policy experts, by doing comparisons across countries, may find that different countries have substantially different levels of effectiveness in their regulatory agencies. I think of Frank Dobbin in his really marvelous historical book, Forging Industrial Policy. He's a political cultural sociologist. And it does seem to me, in a kind of cursory way, that industrial safety and nuclear safety regimes across countries are rather different in their effectiveness. What Frank Dobbin demonstrates in his historical account is that that is indeed true, that there are different cultures of industrial policy in different countries. He compares Britain, Germany, US, and Australia, I believe. And he argues that these are very substantial differences which lead to different outcomes. And that seems believable to me. And so I think it would be very useful in the context of the issues raised in this course to do an in-depth study of nuclear oversight in Germany, France, and the United States. More on Dobbin, but I don't think I'll talk about Dobbin. And so, concluding slide, the problem of establishing strong, independent regulatory agencies of dangerous industries is difficult to solve, both in democracies, but also in one-party states. In China, it's also an enormously difficult problem to solve for a different set of reasons. And yet, this problem must be solved. There is no purely voluntary system that will assure the health and safety of the public in face of complex, dangerous technologies such as those in use all around the globe. It is very possible that the systems in place in Germany, Norway, the US, and Japan have some degree of effectiveness and that these systems can be improved. And so the hard question for public policy designers is how can we improve the effectiveness of our governmental regulatory agencies? How can regulatory agencies themselves be made into high reliability organizations?